You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. Welcome to Necropolis. We're back, episode 70 here, back in black, and we got a positive episode for you today. Last few episodes, other than the interview with Damon, they have been on the negative side where we slaughtered sacred cows on 2 different occasions, and we also slaughtered some legacy bands. So I figured, let's just do a freaking positive episode for once, and let's just talk about some bands that we view as underrated. So we do have the usual crew here today, plus a special guest. We do have Shelly, the co-host, who is about to be a father, and today is Father's Day here in the U.S. Welcome back, Shelly.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We also have that Tyler. Tyler, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Happy to be back.
Yes, sir. We also have Raphael from Hessian Firm. Thank you for coming on, Raphael.
Thank you for bringing me on again.
Yes, sir. Always great to have you. And we do have a special guest, and that guest is Daniel Lake from Decibel Magazine, as well as the author of that USBN book, which has some mixed reactions out there. But overall, I think, it's been more positive than negative. But thank you for coming on, Daniel Lake.
Oh, man. Thanks for having me on. This is great.
Yes, sir. Always great to have you on and chat with you. And, maybe someday we'll have some beers again. But so underrated bands. I had chose 3 bands I quote unquote met last year in Finland. I chose Desecracy, which I met up with Jarno from Desecracy. He was the vocalist for a while. Tommy is the guy who has taken over that project completely. It's a one-man band now, but Jarno was a figure in that band on their seminal albums. So I chose Desecracy because of it's like this really if Bolt Thrower was more ambient and more powerful, I believe. And some of those Desecracy albums, they scratch that itch so well that I think they're honestly better than Bolt Thrower. And especially the Doom Skeptron. There's so many bangers on there that would be like if I was a wrestler in the WWF or WWE, it would be my entrance music when I go down to the wrestling ring and, wrestle the Undertaker and all that. It'd be blasting that Desecracy because it's just so anthemic and so wonderful and so powerful. And it's just so intuitive as well. Like when they hit that mark, they hit it so well that I believe they are vastly underrated. And there's so many OSDM bands nowadays that really missed the mark. There's nothing really unique about the sound that they have. It's just kind of regurgitating flavors of the past, where I do believe Desecracy has its own individual voice. And you can definitely see that with Tommy taking the whole project over. It's just all Tommy now, but he definitely has his own distinctive style, which, like I said, is kind of like a synthesis of Bolt Thrower and other old school death metal bands, but I haven't heard any bands approach it like Tommy has to such a wonderful conclusion that he has. And that's why I chose Desecracy. Any thoughts on Desecracy?
I mean, yeah, you hit the nail on the head with the Bolt Thrower comparison. They're sort of, to me, like a combination of some of the weirder atmospheric elements of older Finnish death metal with the grinding mid-paced brutality of Bolt Thrower. And the way they use guitar leads is really interesting as well, because they don't really introduce traditional melodies or solos as one would expect, but they're kind of just simple little refrains that kind of cycle round, almost like electronic music in a way. And yeah, I'd take the ambient comparison to that as well. They're sort of there providing atmosphere as much as they are melodic development. And yeah, as well, I totally agree that they have a unique voice. They've got I think about 7 albums out now, and you can always tell their voice within, the milieu of modern death metal or whatever. Their signature style does really stand out. And yeah, they just keep churning them out, and hasn't been any sort of major drop in quality in recent years as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, definitely a band that more people should check out.
Yeah, if I would have discovered them when I was a teenager, I probably would have just been really freaking obsessed with them. If I listen to Desecracy as my gateway band, because they are very accessible in terms of really underground death metal. They are very, very accessible. The riffs are not too complex or anything like that. It's just how intuitive they are and how they're layered, and it's like that theme song from 28 Days Later, where it just kind of has that little, four note development, but the layering on top of it is what really brings it into its own distinctive character. And Desecracy does that to a little bit more complex extent, but still, in terms of accessibility, it's very, very accessible music that I believe anyone, regardless of how they come into extreme metal, whether or not they're new to it, they should be able to appreciate Desecracy as well as veterans of the scene too. Any other thoughts on Desecracy?
I definitely agree that they're vastly underrated. They've made some of the most interesting death metal in recent times, and for a pretty decent slew of albums too. I mean, I would say maybe their first 4 albums or so are excellent quality. The first 2 are rather excellent, especially the second, as you already noted. And the bolt thrower comparison is also very apt. It's also interesting that Shelley pointed out that bolt thrower influence is common in Finnish death metal, because I've always thought the same. Everything from Demigod to even like Amorphous' first album, Adremelech, you hear that, as he put it, grinding mid-paced rhythm. And they put it to good use. A lot of people could almost accuse bolt thrower and bands influenced like that by them, like the ones we've mentioned, as having a sort of groove to them. I honestly think that they use rhythm in a different way than what could properly be called groove, to create a sort of I don't know, ratcheting rhythm that in repetition and through slight additions to that repetition creates a sense of ambiance. And Desecracy almost took that further with their use of leads as well. So very excellent band.
Yeah, yeah. And back when I was an exercise nut, running on trails and hitting the gym and all that, Desecracy was on my gym playlist like nonstop. And especially that song, The Sleep of Titans, I would play that on a repeat while running through trails and parks and scaring deer and all that. So, yeah. And another band, I did mention that Yarno was in Desecracy on the first 4 albums, I believe. He has his own solo project called Serpent Ascending, which is another band that I view as underrated. And I first discovered Serpent Ascending because we were label mates, and he was on Void Hanger Records, and I was releasing the Goatcraft through there, and I was checking out some of the bands that was on there, and Serpent Ascending was, and with the Enigma Unsettled, which is a compilation of some demo material from Yarno. I realized, like, wow, this is really competent, Finnish death metal. And there's a distinctive character that Yarno has with how he layers as well. Probably, it's just something probably like from Slugathor to Desecracy to Serpent Ascending, this very intuitive way of layering notes on each other is very, very wonderful. And I did go to the symphony orchestra in Helsinki with him and Marco from Beherit, and Yarno was even saying he's imagining writing music for the orchestra as he was listening to Mahler, Shostakovich, and he was just really, really amazed about how the different parts of the orchestra work together to create the unifying music. And I thought that was really interesting too. And of course, we had brought him on this program, and just kind of talking to him, and he conceptualizes music in his mind first, and then he applies that to guitar. So he'll conceptualize music, beyond just playing on the guitar and coming up with riffs. He actually thinks about the music itself, and then he applies that to guitar. So when it came to the symphony orchestra in Helsinki, that was kind of interesting that he was saying that he was imagining creating music in that regard in his mind while listening to we were right up front too. So it was like boom, all the symphony musicians were right in our face. But yeah, just a really interesting guy. And I of course, I always loved Desecracy, and then I found out Serpent Ascending, and a lot of people hold the album, that the first like true full length Anuku, that a lot of people view that really, really highly. And honestly, I view that, pretty well itself. I think it's a little too compact with how the riffs are, that it may not be as accessible as that Desecracy, but he still has this like very intuitive style of the way that he composes that is distinctively his own. And on his quote unquote heavy metal album, Hyperborean Folklore, which is kind of hard to really compartmentalize that album because he's essentially just playing his influences at that point with Hyperborean Folklore. The second half of that album, when he starts doing that layering again and really getting into it with the clean notes and all that too, it is very, very, very beautiful, and it's some of the most beautiful extreme metal that I've heard, period. So Shelly, I know that was your album of the year last year. What are your thoughts on Serpent Ascending?
Yeah, well, the Hyperborean Folklore album, it did take me by surprise because I think Serpent Ascending sort of passed me by in that I saw them as just another underground death metal band. That's not a comment on them. It's more the fact that I wasn't really paying attention. But the death metal proper is still like really interesting when you bury yourself in it. But yeah, the latest album, Hyperborean Folklore, took me by surprise for how both like linear it is in composition. By that I mean it functions more like a heavy metal album where there are sort of a series of melodies that are introduced with a fairly consistent rhythm rather than death metal, which is sort of much more chopped up and chaotic, but it has this kind of meta logic that sits above it. And he also combines that with what I just call in my head like soundscape metal, and by that I mean it's not just a case of like composition and performance, it's also a case of arrangement. And that's what's happening on Hyperborean Folklore, is him constructing and arranging sounds a bit like one would a landscape painting, placing things in relation to one another in a way that's going to elevate both elements. And he sort of does that in quite a linear way, in that you kind of are introduced to one section, it will build up, themes will kind of be added, and it'll sort of coalesce into something, and then it'll gradually transition into the next piece. And bear in mind, there's only 4 tracks on the album, and they're all kissing like 10 minutes in length. So he kind of really takes his time to do that. And yeah, I completely agree. A really like unique way to write a metal album, and a real like unexpected left turn for what I consider to be like a fairly sort of true blue death metal band to sort of start experimenting with, melodies that are really quite bright and light as well, and very colorful. And to do that and still come off with what is, a challenging heavyweight piece of like extreme metal. Yeah, it's definitely an impressive feat, and yeah, it deserves recognition for that. And that's one of the reasons I picked it as my album of the year last year.
Yeah, I remember last year Yarno had sent it to me early, just like, well, I want to know what your thoughts are. So I had the album like 2 months before it came out. And I remember I went to England. I was hanging out with you at a bar on a patio somewhere, and you had like your Romanian friends there, and I was just playing it on my phone, and everyone was like, "What is this?" It was like, "This is Serpent Ascending." I'm about to go hang out with this guy in a week in Finland, and yeah, it was just really cool because I was really taken aback about just how beautiful. And I don't like to use that word about extreme metal, but there are some very beautiful ways that he layers sounds on top of each other to create, this really, really bigger picture than what most bands approach, riffcraft and all that. He's like world building almost. So any other thoughts on Serpent Ascending?
Sure. I really liked Serpent Ascending's first 2 albums, I guess, because if I remember right, isn't the Enigma Unsettled kind of a somewhat of a compilation? But also kind of a full-length album. I'm kind of the dissenting voice on Hyperborean Folklore. I thought that the use of melody was very interesting, but I thought it lacked somewhat of a center. So while I thought it was very pleasant melodicism to listen to, I didn't feel like this is kind of an overused cliche turn of phrase, like it really went anywhere. So it didn't really stick with me as well. I wrote a review on the album, somewhat saying as much. But it was a very interesting use of melody. and I'm happy that someone was trying to bring in lengthier flowing sense of melody into extreme metal. I do really think that in relation to Desecracy, that the first two albums had a really excellent sort of ambient use of melody and of like repeated phrases that gradually changed throughout the piece that made them some of the best material I've heard in recent times. I'm excited to hear what he's going to do in the future.
Yeah, we're doing a split, the GoCraft and the Serpent Ascending. So I know he's wrapping up his side of that, so unsure exactly when that'll be coming out. But yeah, he approached me a couple of years ago. I would like to say about that, but we're just now getting around to it. I know for sure it'll come out on vinyl through Voidhanger, but other than that, I don't know for sure about a CD release. But anyway, yeah, that's Serpent Ascending. I do view this project as having the most like real potential to really carve out a unique stance on extreme metal, depending on how Yarno goes in the future. And that's the wonderful thing about one man bands is that he has complete control of it. He has a clear vision of what he's doing with it. And so like he did with Hyperborean Folklore, that came out of left field 100%. But I know Tyler may not think it's quote unquote narrative or going to logical places, of how the songs are constructed. But I view that it's more about the ride than the destination. It's more about that ride where you see some of the very, very expansive, beautiful melodies that he's able to put together and layer. And that's what really makes it more special. And there's this distinctive, like intuitive style that he has too, that should not go unstated. It's very distinctly Yarno. He's not mimicking anyone else. He's mimicking his soul. It's like he's just trying to unleash his true essence upon the music, and it comes from a very, very sincere place. So the third band I chose is Beherit, but not the metal Beherit. There's this other side of Beherit, which is the electronic side. And honestly, I love the metal side of Beherit, but I view the electronic side as just being as good as the metal side. And with that electric doom synthesis, I've listened to that so many freaking times. I know other people have said it's great driving around music. I've had experiences like that too, where I'm driving through a downtown district and that just happened to be playing. I was like, wow, this is the perfect vibe music for driving through like a hellish downtown landscape. So with electric doom synthesis, I view that Marco is able to capture the fury and the rage and his black metal style completely in electronic forms. Especially I've been dicking around with like guitar work on keyboards. And he was actually the first I've ever heard do that on electric doom synthesis, where he has a keyboard and he's mimicking distorted guitars with that. But anyway, it's very, very like all these other Finnish bands. So the word intuitive keeps coming at the forefront of my mind when trying to describe these Finnish bands. Is very, very intuitive. It's very, I can tell because I met Marco last year and he's a very introverted guy, but then again, most Finnish people are. I view the electronic era Beherit as being just as good as the black metal. I know the Bardo Exists, which came out in 2020, did meet some mixed reviews, but the thing about Beherit is he's never released a bad album. The worst that you'll get from him is good, not like bad or even average. But I did hear some dissenting voices about Bardo Exists being a little too just focusing on textures and kind of like a soundtrack. But even in those terms, it still wasn't bad. So any thoughts on the electronic side of Beherit?
I'll just jump in and say, I think some people, particularly on the black metal side, just they don't get Beherit. And I think the reason I'm saying that is because I view the electronic side of Beherit as a clear extension and a clear re-articulation of what he's doing on the black metal side. they're two sides of the same coin for me, especially when you look at where some of the weirder quote unquote aspects of like drawing down the moon cropped up. There were sort of dark ambient interludes and kind of strange atmospheric flourishes scattered across that album that clearly slide into where he was going with the ambient electronic albums. And even like his most straightforward album, something like Engram, it has, you know, the closing track, Demon Advance, which is like a 15-minute long sludging dirge, which again sort of fades away into ambience, and it kind of pivots on this repetition. It's almost like a piece of minimalist industrial that played in a sort of metallic setting. So I think that the people that dismiss the electronic albums from Beherit, they clearly haven't quite got the point of some of his like black metal work and what makes it so unique. Because I think they kind of dismiss Beherit on the basis of like the Oath of Black Blood and sort of lump them in with as like a blasphemy sort of war metal thing. But there's so much more going on to his black metal stuff. It's so much more eccentric and weird. And yeah, the electronic doom synthesis is like the paragon of that vision on the electronic side, and it's really communicating very similar sort of themes and visions, just with completely different materials and technology. So yeah, I'd agree with you on that one, Jason.
Yeah, I remember sharing electric doom synthesis with this guy, Jason Thomas, who's a musician out in California. I think he also has his own podcast now. He goes by the name Corpsey, and he could not stand it. I'm like, dude, this is essentially Beherit. It's just the textures are slightly changed. Something that I do want to mention is that Marco was really, really into the EDM scene for a long time. He was a DJ, so a lot of those guys in EDM, they're like really, really obsessed with like textures and production values and all that. And I can kind of tell that because Marco and I had worked on some music together, and before I was in Finland, I sent him a track and he kept writing me back. It was like, there's distortion in this. Get rid of the distortion. I'm like, what are you talking about, dude? And I was listening to all these, different speakers and headphones and earbuds, and was just trying to, I do not hear distortion. And then when I got to Finland, he was like, oh yeah, the distortion was coming from my speaker. I'm like, dude, here you are putting me like through the loops with trying to figure out exactly what's wrong with the texture. But it's probably because he does come from an EDM scene where there is a huge emphasis on production values, and that's probably like with Bardo exists, that influence came out even more because the textures in there are super crisp. But I actually I just looked it up while I was chatting. That Jason Thomas guy, his podcast is called Cinematic Suffering. I guess this is about horror movies, but yeah, I'm just going to name drop him here because he did not like that electric doom synthesis. There's something wrong with that guy. But Daniel, you haven't said anything in a long time. What are your thoughts on Beherit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all in with what you guys are saying about it so far. I don't have a lot of experience with the non-black metal Beherit, so I just kind of dip my toes into it. It's very cool, and I maybe that's the point of this podcast is underrated bands and getting people to listen more to it. I'll absolutely spend more time with it. My experience is much more with the black metal Beherit stuff, but yeah, this was cool stuff.
Yeah, I think you'll like Electric Doom Synthesis. There's another album that came out before that. It starts with an H with a whole bunch of numbers. It's kind of like a proto Electric Doom Synthesis. Like you can tell like the raw ideas of what he was going to cultivate later were in that first album, but it's still not even bad. Like it's good listening experience, and he's been alive for 150 years, therefore he is a god. Very iconic lines like that. And all right, cool. So Shelly, what are your three underrated bands? If you want to go one by one or all together, up to you.
I'll go one by one, but I'll just clarify by saying I've chosen my definition of underrated a bit vaguely, in that it's really just it's not three bands of the same caliber. It's just three bands that I don't think are rated according to their body of work. So I'll start with probably the most obscure and then work up. The first one is a death metal band from Chile called Mortify, who I only discovered last year. It's another one that was in my top, I think it was my top 5 albums from last year. They released an album called Fragments at the Edge of Sorrow, which is it's hard to sort of talk about like the glory days of death metal now without sounding like you are just sort of super into old school death metal trend stuff. But this album really, it emulates the, what's the word, the vision or the idea of death metal in its heyday, rather than just copying the like forms and techniques without really understanding like what motivated it. So, you know, it has elements of like old school Morbid Angel, Gorguts, the Chasm. There's some Finnish influence in there as well. And it brings back the weird elements of death metal as well. In that there's a lot of quirky things in there. There's a bit of cenotaph, stuff like that. And it has oodles of atmosphere as well, which really kind of marry up with the riffs in a really effective way. So I'm highlighting these guys not just to highlight Mortify, who I think are just a band that more people should know about, but also just, I don't know if I'm going crazy, but from my little corner of the world, it seems like something is happening in Chile and more broadly in South America as well. I know South America has many sort of classic bands going all the way back to the 70s and 80s, but for me, like every now and then, I'll just keep seeing a band crop up where they just blow the genre out of the water in terms of their interpretation of it, and they invariably seem to be from Chile. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that and say, like, for instance, there's a black and thrash band called Demoniac that again are just one of the best things I've heard in the last 5 or 10 years. Sepulchrum, who are another a bit more of a like thrashy death metal band, but again really solid. I came across a heavy metal band the other day called Latalis that are just absolutely insane. I could go on. I'll probably write an article about it at some point. But also like, yeah, bands like Condor from Colombia as well, Death Slaughter, Illumination and the Cryptic from Brazil, Ancient Gate from Argentina. There's a lot going on down there, and Mortify are they're another example of just Chile in particular taking like an element of extreme metal and just really showing like North American and European bands how it's done. I think, I don't know if any of you guys have come across it or want to comment at all, but I'll throw it open.
Yeah, I gave them a listen because I had seen a couple of your reviews about them, because you had the Hate Meditations review, and then you had the Metal Legion magazine review, and I'm like, okay, Shelley's really talking these guys up, and I did check.
To be fair, when I review a band for Metal Legion and I've already done a Hate Meditations review, it means I have to write 2 reviews, because he's asked me, like, and completely fairly, don't publish the Metal Legion reviews on my own site, which is totally fair. So when I come across an album that I really like, I have to write 2 fucking reviews for it, which for an album like Mortify, I could probably write 5. But yeah, that's why that happened.
Yeah, what I kind of thought about that album, it was very labyrinthine. The way the atmosphere is, and you know how, I mean, there was some like a little bit of progressive influences, but it was one of those like really riff oriented. You know, there was a lot of Tampa death metal influence in there too. They could have been, you know, 1995 Tampa death metal, like no one, like Eulogy or something like that no one really knows about. But yeah, like you're saying, that South America is a hotbed for like the old school type of death metal, but not that OSDM that is really, really popular here in the States, like Blood Incantation and bands like that. But it's more of like these guys, you can tell they have more skin in the game, quote unquote, where, you know, that thriving culture is still, that was the early Tampa death metal scene is thriving in South America, as well as, you know, you go to different countries and there's like a different type of zeitgeist that's there about metal. Like when I was in Ukraine, the metalheads in Ukraine were different than in the US. Like there's so many Ukrainians wearing death metal shirts I just randomly saw. And in Kiev, there was a like an extreme metal shop, as well. Big old shop. It was called Core Metal, actually. Yeah, that was the name of it. But anyway, getting back to South America, I remember checking out a shit ton of bands from that part of the world when I was younger, like Anal Vomit and all of that, and they range from like the really bestial war metal to death metal, such as this with the Mortify. And what really stuck out the most with Mortify, which I would honestly place it above a lot of those other bands that are over there, is the just really intricate riffs, uh, and there is like a slight progressive sound to it as well, which kind of is like reminiscent of like the early Tampa death metal scene, without it being contrived and surface level. So I do think there's a shit ton of potential there with that Mortify. However, I it's not as memorable to me as like some of these other bands that we'll be discussing. But I do view that they have a shit ton of potential, and I really hope they take it to the next level.
Yeah, I think Labyrinthine is a really good way to describe them. It kind of reminds me of Cenotaph's The Gloomy Reflection of Our Hidden Sorrows, in that you kind of they sort of build an atmosphere through the riffs and then introduce like these really oddball kind of lead guitar elements. And yeah, I think that's where the progressiveness comes in, where it's not trying to really overwork it like like some people would say about certain death albums or whatever. It's much more subtle than that. And yeah, I think it's hard to put your finger on, but if you listen to a band like Tomb Mold and then compare it to a band like Mortify, you kind of get who really understands what like death metal was originally about and what it could or should be like used to express, rather than just sort of creating the feel or a kind of facsimile of it. And yeah, like I will accept Mortify is still quite young. They're only into their second album and they have a lot of potential. They can build on it. But yeah, I also just picked them because I wanted to sort of highlight South America as a hotspot. So yeah, moving on to the next band, I have picked on the black metal side, Temple of Abraxas, who are a solo black metal band headed by Sleepwalker, who we've had on the podcast a few times. He had another project called A Transylvanian Funeral. And with Temple of Abraxas, I mean, Transylvanian Funeral was very kind of straightforward, classic era black metal. And when I say that, it kind of makes it sound quite boring, but he has a way with black metal, similar to Mortify in a lot of ways, in that he seems to just understand what motivates like the really straightforward tremolo riffs, blast beats, quite an obscure atmosphere, lo-fi production, but not like abrasive, like, or unlistenable static, still like powerful enough to draw you in, and also a sense of like melodrama to it as well, obviously with a name like A Transylvanian Funeral. And with Temple of Abraxas, he's kind of expanded on that and taken it in a slightly more abstract, I would say, esoteric or mystical kind of space. And I really want to highlight an album he released in 2019 called Temples Forlorn, which is a really simple, really sparse album, but it has this unique, it's one of the most unique atmospheres I've come across in recent years, where it just pulls you in. And the riffs, again, they're very simple, but they unfurl in really kind of clever and engaging ways. And he kind of has this ability to kind of transition, but make it seem really, really flowing. And the melodies like unfurl in really kind of satisfying, I mean, I'm going to borrow your word, Jason, intuitive kind of ways. And it's that perfect marriage of like a really unique atmosphere with the songwriting underneath. And much like Desecracy, it's not the most complex music. It's pretty straightforward in terms of like the actual compositions and the riffing. But again, it's not like what you do. It's not the music itself. It's what you do with it. It's how you craft it and how you arrange it. And I think that's what makes Temple of Abraxas so special. Has anyone come across them? Again, another relatively obscure one, but I'll throw it open again.
Yeah, I was actually signed to his record label with my first album. So, yeah, I've been a champion of Sleepwalker for a long time now. It was really strange, like you were talking about his production, but he actually has a full-fledged recording studio. And he does like video game music now, and like he does the soundtrack to Dusk, and I know he just did the sequel soundtrack too. So, with the boomer shooter stuff. But yeah, he's found a niche outside of extreme metal just to be creative with. You know, he's always doing all these different projects. Like he wrote a book, a fantasy novel. He had his record label at one point. He had a magazine. He was a real estate agent at one point, and just all these. I think he's in school right now, going for another degree or something like that. So, he's one of those guys who's all over the place, but he's able to handle projects with a lot of care. And he was with Forbidden Records. He was the guy who thrusted my project into the spotlight. But yeah, 100% agree with what you said. And I do view Temples Forlorn being one of the highlights. I did write a review the last album, 1931, which is all Roman numerals on the album title. But and with that, it's even more straightforward and to the point, and like you said, he has an intuitive way of the way he puts the logic to the riffs and how they're ordered, and yeah, Temples Forlorn I view has some of the best keyboard work in USBM. Very definitely a big underrated USBM project, Daniel. I know you're the author of the book, and we can talk all day about bands that weren't in there, especially GBK. Where's the GBK? But yeah, definitely a great project, great guy. Been in contact with him for a decade now, and nothing bad to say about him whatsoever. Being you wrote that book about USBM, Daniel, any thoughts on Temple of Abraxas?
Oh yeah, you're right. That wasn't one of the bands that made it, but I'm really interested in this guy's stuff. I got to hear Transylvanian Funeral a little while ago, and was listening to the Temple of Abraxas stuff, and really into like. There's some cool like guitar like solo intro type things, and it also occurred to me how much of the drumming, the riffing, some of those performances feel like that kind of almost that they reach out again for that kind of early punk like anti-death metal version of black metal, where like death metal is too complicated and too musical, and this is reaching back to something that's more about the simple, the atmosphere, the occult driven side of things, with some really cool sounds going on in there. Yeah, I was into that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I know you said he's got his own recording studio, Jason, but yeah, it still comes across as a very like DIY homegrown project in a good way. And like I said, none of it's sort of overly complex, and it manages to maintain like the exhilaration and the power of black metal, but like what was I going to say? It's sort of like some of it is also quite catchy in a lot of ways. Like the Transylvanian Funeral album, The Outsider, which again I would highlight. A lot of the riffs on there are really kind of quite memorable and quite accessible in a lot of ways. But yeah, he places them in a certain context that just sounds really powerful and very kind of theatrical as well. So does anyone else have any thoughts on this before I move on to my final pick?
I definitely want to highlight. I know we're talking about Temple of Abraxas, but it's pretty much the same band as A Transylvanian Funeral, and The Outsider I view as one of the best black metal releases from the U.S. in the 2000s. That time frame, I view it being one of the best USBM releases. I know, it wasn't in your book, Daniel, because he was pretty well like unknown, but he's definitely up there with one of the best USBM in my opinion, at least. But we can split hairs all day about the book, and what is in the book is a pretty good characterization of US black metal, and I'm definitely not going to split hairs that one of my favorite USBM bands wasn't in it. And it was funny, like when he came out with the book, everyone was like, "Where's Grand Belial's key?" and they were in the book.
They were in the book, weren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, they were. And the Decibel and Daniel Lake were getting a lot of shit over that. It's like, where's GBK? And so yeah, these already gotten a lot of shit that was unneeded, even back when the book was coming out, and they were indeed in the book. So what's your third band, Shelley?
Well, it's like I always say, if you're pissing off people on both sides, you're probably doing something right. My third band is of an entirely different caliber because I thought I would, rather than me just picking my little pet loves at the moment, you can always just check out my albums from last year and the year before if you want to see some more like obscure newer releases. But my final pick was the Chasm from Mexico. And the reason for picking these guys, I don't know if they are bigger in across the pond, but in the UK or in Europe, to my mind, given their body of work, their consistency, and the quality of their material and how unique it is, again, like Desecracy, you can always tell a Chasm album. They have such a unique approach to composition, just the signature style to their riffs and the way that they, again, arrange everything. It's just so identifiable and so unique. And they've managed to sort of maintain a level of consistency over a considerable number of albums. I think they should be as big as like the silverback gorillas of death metal, but for me they're just not. They're sort of a band that a good audience know and respect, but they're not approaching the same level as a Suffocation or a Morbid Angel or whatever. And to my mind, they should be. They deserve to be in that canon far more than some of the bands that are in that canon. And again, I don't know if it's because they weren't from the US or something, but then I think Sepultura got huge because they kind of got the lucky break at Morrisound or not. But yeah, to my mind, they should be a household name, and for me, they always seem to be treated as sort of second or third division by the death metal audience. But I don't know if that chimes with you guys or not, or if I'm just maybe on the wrong side of the Atlantic to come across their audience.
I personally, I've spent very little time with the Chasm, and even prepping for this episode, I didn't listen to them. But no, you're completely correct. It's like I don't hear them mentioned much in many different circles, but I have checked them out at various points in my life. They seem to be quite big. They might have a sizable audience. But then again, I haven't really spent that much time with them to really have like a fully formed opinion of their music. And according to their Wikipedia, it shows that they're currently residing in Chicago. So
okay, right.
yeah, they may be branching out into the US scene a little bit more, so they might get a little bit more popular. But honestly, I know on your website you had an image of from the Chasm on there on Hate Meditations, but I think you did at least. I might be misremembering.
Posted a review of one of their albums on there, and yeah, the main guy, Daniel Corchedo, he played on Diabolical Conquest by Incantation. He was vocals and bass on that album as well. And
he was also on Cenotaph's debut.
Yes, as well, yeah. And he was asked to join Incantation full time, but he wanted to focus on the Chasm, which is fair enough. But yeah, I mean, they're not the most accessible. It's quite a dense sound that they've got. It's very composed, and it can be a little bit what's the word, overbearing at times. It's quite intense. It's very slow and kind of swirling, but I think they create this kind of wall of dissonant sound, but not dissonance in the kind of Decibel Omega sense. There is melody there too, and there is dynamics, but they're not as like catchy or playful as some of the US death metal bands. But yeah,
which album?
Raphael, sorry.
Yeah, which album would you recommend to someone who's not familiarized with them?
It definitely took them a couple to get going, but I would say maybe the third album, Death Cult for Eternity, The Triumph, or the one after that, Procession to the Infraworld. Either one of those two. I mean, like I said, they've got a shitload of albums, but either one of those two is probably like the best way into the Chasm, because I think that they're the sort of two most like complete statements of what they're about. But yeah, does anyone else have any thoughts on the Chasm?
Sure, I'll offer some thoughts. I think that the Chasm has a somewhat devoted audience, although it's a smaller audience of people who appreciate more thoroughgoing death metal with a little more thought to it, so to speak. But as far as their presence in the idea of death metal as a whole, or even as, um, I guess you can say, a certain brand of death metal, like apart from like the trends of like brutal death metal or whatever, they're relatively unknown. And in that regard, I can see why you would consider them underrated. I've had an on and off affair with the band throughout my life. I was a really big fan of them when I was younger. As I've grown older, my opinion on them has kind of cooled. I like some of the weird style of riffing and some of the attempt to work in an oddball style of melody, which honestly sometimes kind of reminds me of some of the other bands that had an oddball approach, like DBC is one that comes to mind, Dead Brain Cells on.
Mm.
But the problem that I guess I would, if I were to list one with the Chasm, is that sometimes I feel like a lot of their riffing really reminds me of thrash metal with like a progressive touch. And there's a really deep knowledge of like harmony there. And that's really impressive. But the riffing to me kind of starts to blur together as once you strip away some of the ornamentation, kind of basic metal riffs. That's just my personal opinion, though, and I don't want to let that get in the way of the fact that they are very talented. Daniel Corrachado is a very talented man. I would say one of the most talented composers in all of underground metal, and that as far as their being underrated, they are certainly underrated in regard to in the context of what the quality of their work is.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's fair enough. And again, it speaks to the fact that they've got a lot of albums out, and I wouldn't do what I did today, which is sort of sit down and listen to them all back to back. But yeah, I do take the point that there is again that word sort of linear comes up again, where they're not sort of doing super angular stuff, sort of circa mid 90s Gorguts, or even some Morbid Angel as well. There is a kind of flowing pace to it, which does speak of like, yeah, more of a older kind of foundation based in sort of thrash metal and heavy metal. But yeah, that it really is that composition and arrangement that sticks to me is that, yeah, the weird approach to harmony and the weird sort of dynamics as well. And yeah, they just sound completely like themselves. And yeah, they should be a classic, and they're just not quite there. There's a group of people in the metal community that are in the know, which they well deserve. But I think they deserve more. But yeah, unless there are any other thoughts on the Chasm, we can move on from my choices.
Yes. Nice choice.
That's me done though. That's me.
Those are three bands, Jason.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were going to do a death-based chamber orchestra.
I was going to do that, and they do deserve an audience, but they're not a metal band, so I didn't know if the criteria had to be metal, and also they are starting to gain a respectable following in the UK as people are catching on. But yeah, I'll be real brief about this one. Dead Space Chamber Music are essentially an English Dead Can Dance in that they borrow like old English folk melodies, old medieval music, and sound arts, and combine it with elements of doom and noise. I'll just be straight up. They don't sound anything like Dead Can Dance, but philosophically speaking, they experiment in a very similar way, and they sound distinctively English. So if you're into neo-folk, bit of noise, bit of like medieval music and classical, check out Dead Space Chamber Music. But yeah, we can move on to Tyler now.
Tyler.
I'm here. Sorry. Was trying to maneuver the monitor a little bit. Anyway, all right. So for three bands that I consider underrated, I'm going to start with the kind of the opposite of Shelley. Start with the ones that are probably lesser known and move on to the ones that are more known. So my first one is going to be a Romanian death metal band that released what, in my opinion, was one of the best albums from last year, I believe, called Rotheads. Their album that they released last year was called Slither and Slime. These guys, in my opinion, truly understand the spirit of old school, if you want to call it that, death metal. They understand it without just simply replicating the accomplishments of past bands. They understand the idea of working in, how do I want to put this? I suppose I could say that a complaint I've had about more recent death metal is that it's become standardized how to make death metal. And I think some of the early death metal artists had more freedom in the sense that they didn't have an idea of what death metal was supposed to sound like, but they had an idea of wanting to create certain sounds to evoke a certain atmosphere or feeling or experience, generally a horrifying one. And I think that Rotheads actually accomplishes that on their most recent album. It was some well received, the album, but I think that they could have been given a lot more praise than they got. I think that there were a lot more albums that were released last year, veritable deluge of them, as a matter of fact, that were raved about that were far less interesting. They had Rotheads on Slither and Slime almost hearkening to the title of the album. The music kind of moves almost like an organic mass, with different parts kind of pulling at each other. And in the sense of some of the groups that we talked about with Jason having a repetition that intensifies rather than exhausting the listener. They don't really try to incorporate anything that rather irritates me in newer death metal by trying to differentiate itself with very superficial progressive approaches, or by relying on tired tropes in heavy metal to try to identify themselves as some kind of true project. Even though their riffing is, basic, very basic. So yeah, I think that Rotheads deserves a lot more praise than they've got. I think that their album should have been considered one of the best out of the genre in 2022.
Okay, I had difficulty getting into Rotheads because of their freaking name. I thought it was like the Rothheads, like it's the Rothschilds creating death metal, and the name was really, really off-putting. Until I actually sat down and I saw, people raving about them, and I thought it was pretty competent stuff. Definitely a notch above the OSDM, quote unquote, that is in flavor with the Dark Descent catalog and things like that. But I did listen to it. It didn't really seem like, it kept my attention at least. And that's more than I can say about a lot of projects these days. It did keep my attention. So, I would say in that regard, they're a little underrated if something's able to keep my attention for the whole album. But I didn't feel like they were breaking really new ground in any ways. But Shelly, go ahead. I know you wrote a review about them.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, along with Mortify, these guys were very high on my best of list last year, number 5. And I would say for very similar reasons. They're not similar stylistically, but again, a similar approach to understanding old school death metal as an idea rather than just a series of signifiers. Whereas Mortify take the oddball kind of abstract and almost horrifying aspects. I think Rotheads kind of managed to combine the sludgy, slimy aspects of death metal with the dark romanticism, and take it in a more sort of grandiose direction, but also still very grounded and very gritty. And for me, yeah, that's why it stood out so much. And again, it's not something you can necessarily articulate every time, other than to say you just have to sit down and listen to the albums. And sometimes you can tell when an artist truly understands that they have something to communicate through the medium of death metal, and they're not just trying to make noise that sounds like death metal, or just, take the various aspects of it and chunk it all together like an AI wrote it or something. And Rotheads is one of those bands that truly had a vision to communicate and knew how to craft that vision through the materials of classic death metal, and therefore ended up sounding very much like themselves, much like Mortify. And completely agree. More people should know about them, and I'll continue to plug them at every opportunity.
Yeah, that synth part that they do on the first track on Slither and Slime, Vampiric Inbreeding, that sounds straight out of a soundtrack from a horror movie from the 80s. It creates a very sort of sinister ambiance that they then transfer directly into playing the same melody in a very death metal style on the first riff. I thought that was genius. I thought that was illustrating exactly what I was talking about, where they were actually writing riffs to create an atmosphere or evoke a certain experience of horror rather than just writing something because this is a death metal riff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Completely agree. It's sort of that synergy between arrangement, texture, and like quality composition. So yeah, I'm totally on board with that.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on Rotheads? All right, well then I can move into my next band, which is a little bit more well-known than Rotheads. I'm going to pick Drawn and Quartered. They have a pretty solid following in the underground scene, but I think that their following, I'm going to apply underrated to them in the sense that I don't think it's as much as they deserve. They have released a pretty good body of work. They've always maintained a certain level of quality throughout all of their albums. And their most recent album was one of the better ones of last year as well, I will say. I think that they have kept up a sort of unique take on death metal when a lot of other bands were simply following trends or repeating past successes. And they've even somewhat progressed throughout their career from making straight ahead, more kind of on the brutal side of death metal to adding in more doom elements and melodic elements. I will say that they do have something that holds them back a little bit, which is that they go for so much of a certain kind of dissonance to create a chaotic atmosphere that it kind of can kind of reduce how individual some of their riffs, it can reduce the character of some of their riffs. And that I think if they could move forward to create more evocative, more unique riffing, that it would actually take them a step above into one of possibly the best death metal bands in the scene right now. But I also think that sometimes that chaotic atmosphere lends itself to the themes that they are going for, which is kind of the human mind descending into a form of madness or fragmentation. I do think that pretty much everybody here is really familiar with them. But like I said, I think they deserve somewhat more praise than they receive. They seem to not really be one of the bands that's brought up when people are talking about the hot bands in death metal at this time.
I will tell you this, Drawn and Quartered has given me blue balls more than any other band on the planet. I have kept up with them for 15 years now, and I've thought they are on the precipice or really close to that threshold numerous times, but they have yet to breach into true greatness. And in that regard, that I've given them so many chances, and I feel like the ball is always dropped somewhere on in their entire catalog. Actually, where I feel like they just keep blue balling me over and over and over. But what they are very competent death metal. They do have a wide range of quote unquote correct influences or whatnot. Traditional death metal influences. Even I would say immolation is one of them. But there's always something that's just not there yet. And all of their albums it's not really realized to the fullest capability. There's a lack of focus somewhere. And so I view that they are rather popular for the type of quality they are putting out. So I wouldn't really say they're underrated. And I do want to say, on the record, that they've given me blue balls at least 5 times. So.
Well, I will say I'm not as familiar with them as you guys, but I did review one of their albums a couple of years ago, and they strike me as like a real workhorse of like solid death metal. I probably need to go back and give them another try based on what Tyler's saying to draw a proper conclusion. But for me, yeah, they never really grabbed me. And I'm going to mention the Plague Bearer in the room because the guys had like a sort of semi-black and black slash death metal released this year under the name Plague Bearer, and I reviewed it very highly. I thought it was an incredible album, sort of references to immolation and stuff. But I know that Jason and Tyler weren't quite as impressed by it. But for me, that was sort of where these guys' talents lie, and Drawn and Quartered never really grabbed me in the same way. But I will confess, yeah, I haven't sort of done a deep dive into their discography for a while, so maybe I should go back and see what they're about.
Yeah, I
Raphael,
was not as pleased with Plague Bearer, but for many of the same reasons that you said you weren't pleased with Drawn and Quartered. But yeah, anyway, yeah, Raphael, sorry to interrupt you, Jason.
yeah, I was just calling on Raphael because he hasn't said anything in like an hour. So, Raphael, any thoughts on those bands, Drawn and Quartered or Plague Bearer?
Well, probably not the best time for me to chime in because honestly, I'm not very familiar with either of them. I have listened to some of Dawn and Quarter. I think it was their latest album. And overall, I guess I'm more like the opinion that you guys were expressing that closely resembles mine the most is yours, Jason. I think that there's definitely some qualities there. But yes, I think overall the impression that I got was that there was a lot of unfocus. But again, I really should get back to listening to both that latest album and uh, other of their work to have a more informed opinion. But anyway, the most immediate impression that I had from the very little that I've listened to is more or less that. Yeah.
All right, that's fair. Yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the next band, and I know this one may generate some conversation. Go ahead, Tyler.
All right, so the last band I chose I think is pretty pertinent because they just released a new album 2 days ago, but I'm going to choose Samoth. And while they do receive a lot of praise in certain circles, I think that they're underrated in the sense that through many years, when black metal, the kind of music they play, has been chasing all sorts of various trends from depressive suicidal black metal to progressive black metal to dissonant black metal to orthodox black metal. Samoth has always stayed the line with releasing fairly consistent quality, intense death black metal. And while I would say that you could say the quality has varied between some of their works, they've always kind of stayed true to their approach. And I also think that you can see a sort of movement in their discography where their albums oftentimes were the band working on techniques that they slowly perfected over time. A lot of people feel that their peak is Godless Arrogance, and I'm not necessarily going to argue with that. That's probably in their later style, which is pretty much everything from the second album forward, the perfection of their purest black metal approach. But I also think that their most recent two albums were good, and I was very pleased with their most recent album. Samoth has a really excellent approach of creating a contrast between chaotic and violent riffing and a soaring sense of melody, almost as if you're in the midst of some kind of battle and then being taken to a bird's eye view of the battle where you're seeing its significance. And that really relates well to their theme because they generally focus on themes of war and combat. And while I think that they do, like I said, receive a decent amount of praise, they always seem to not be well known by people who are really well versed in black metal. And people who are really well versed in black metal tend to list other bands, sometimes bands that just happen to be the hot topic at the moment. And they seem to get bypassed by a large portion of the black metal scene and the heavy metal scene in general. But yeah, I'll open it up to other thoughts on the band now.
Shelley, do you
Yeah.
want to start? I mean, we've been chatting a lot about Samoth, off the record. And I feel that Shelley will encapsulate my thoughts because he recently revisited Godless Arrogance and came to the same conclusion that I have. So go ahead, Shelley.
Well, I came to the same conclusion in that Godless Arrogance is not a riff-based album in that it's black metal that's like war program music. It's focused on war, and similar to very early Bolt Thrower, sort of Realm of Chaos era, it works like the music is literally a metaphor for the various aspects of battle, specifically, obviously, the Second World War and the Western Front. And the instruments kind of have a unifying like purpose behind them. So the chaos of the riff of the guitar work is kind of backed up by very sort of creative and fluid drum work. On their latest album, Greberberg, they have started to work in much more obvious melodic flourishes, particularly like the tremolo picked riffs, and much more obvious riffing full stop. Now, this is the point where Jason and I diverge, because I really like appreciated and really loved that aspect of the album, and I thought it was kind of a welcome course correction, or just taking the formula of Godless Arrogance and looking at it from a different angle. And for me, that really worked. But I know that, Jason, it didn't necessarily chime with you. But speaking more generally on Samoth's legacy, it's similar to what I was trying to say with the Chasm, in that they do have a respectable following, and people that know about them definitely like know and respect them. But yeah, they should be kind of a household name when people are sort of rattling off like classic death metal classic black metal bands, especially black metal bands that have kind of kept the flame alive post 2000 as well, because for a certain stripe of black metal, it kind of faded into the background, whilst more kind of symphonic or overtly depressive or sort of indie-based versions of black metal were gaining popularity, whereas Samoth stayed the course with this very straightforward, very brutal, kind of very chaotic form of black metal. And they deserve accolades for that. And now they're still coming out with a fresh take on that sound again and sort of adding to their vocabulary. So yeah, for me, definitely agree with their being picked for this episode.
Yeah, I would be interested in hearing Daniel's thoughts on them if he has any, because I know that his book focused on US black metal, but that gives me the impression that he's pretty knowledgeable on black metal as a genre as a whole. And so, Daniel, have you heard of Samoth? And if so, how do you feel about them?
I've sent him Godless Arrogance before. Daniel, kind of put the spotlight on you just randomly. Any thoughts on Samoth?
I mean, not deep thoughts. You guys did a great job, handling that. Yeah, I mean, the style is really great, like you were saying about how being consistent over their works. I think the guitar tones rule. That dedication to kind of a lo-fi sound is pretty great. It's not an immediate hit for me. Like I'm not sure that I'm going back to it a whole bunch. Maybe I'd need to hear it and specifically hear it with people, like in the company of people who are really enjoying it, to like get more out of it. I mean, it's cool, but it kind of slid off a little bit.
You know what? That's kind of my opinion with this new album they put out. It's really riff oriented, and like Shelley was saying, like Godless Arrogance, I view it more like a metal orchestra, not in like being very intricate or a lot of different voices or anything like that. I mean that there's so much synergy between the different parts of the band. Like whenever there's a choppy riff that really doesn't make much sense. Granted, this album is about chaos, and just the raw feral aspects of black metal. But the way the instruments work together to create this unified whole is wonderful on Godless Arrogance. So when there's like a choppy guitar riff, that guitar riff by itself with interesting drum patterns behind it would fail, honestly. But because the band comes together and there is this great synergy, the drums kind of take the forefront for a second, and then it moves on to a different transition. Then this bass line just comes out of nowhere, and it's just wonderful how all these bits and pieces come together to create this feral statement of black metal. Whereas this new album, I thought it was really good. I never said it was bad or anything like that. It kept my attention. I did listen to the whole thing the day it came out. But the thing about that, contrasted with Godless Arrogance, it's a guitar riff album, and there's nothing bad about that. But what's really unique about Samoth is that Godless Arrogance, where they did create like the most feral representation of bombastic black metal ever. And honestly, for me, I had heard Godless Arrogance a few times, just out of people raving about it. But it wasn't until I was plastered drunk that it really clicked for me. I turned it on one time when I was drunk. I'm like, this is fucking chaotic awesomeness in an inebriated state. It just made perfect fucking sense. And ever since then, it's just withstand the test of time with me. Like, and when I compare the new album, it's like, yes, there are really good parts. There's really great riffs in it too. But as a whole, I do not feel the same synergy that is in the Godless Arrogance. So, with that, I will echo Daniel Lake's stance that it is cool. It is, there's a little bit of a lo-fi aspect to it, but it's rather well produced. But I do view the new one as way better than Across the Rhine Is Only Death. I honestly, I didn't ever make it through that album, so I do view it as they're taking the project in a better direction. But when it comes to like the best in their catalog, is by far, at least for me, it's Godless Arrogance. So that's my thoughts on that. I know Raphael, you're well versed with Samoth too. Do you have any thoughts on them?
Yeah, well, I guess you guys already said the essential, and I do agree that Godless Arrogance was the peak, and that's when all of the several threads that they were exploring finally came together in the most in the purest form. But one thing that hasn't been brought up yet, and I'd like to give a little attention to that, is an album that I think is underrated even within Samoth's discography, which is the very first one, Stretched. Of course, like Tyler was saying, Samoth went on. It's an interesting band in the sense that they explored quite a few, even though they have a very definite, a very well defined core. I think they went on exploring several different techniques and ideas, and even certain stylistic and aesthetical choices throughout their career. And on that very first album, of course, it's still a very they're still in the larval form, so to speak. But I think there's a lot of interesting things to pick up anyway, especially the way they handle melody in that one. I think it's probably the only Samoth album where melody is handled in that way, in terms of longer melodies and also the presence of keyboards, for example. And in a sense, it's their album that's the closest to conventional black metal because, as we were saying, they still haven't quite nailed their own unique voice. But anyway, for all these reasons, I think it's a very interesting album for anyone to check out. Yeah.
I agree with that. I think that there's more similarities to Strid to their later discography than some people may at first think. I think the keyboards kind of contribute to feeling that it's vastly different, but the riffing still has that chaotic, very warlike feel. But they do definitely do their longest melodies on that album. I think on their most recent album, they kind of return to that sense of melody, but in a shortened form. I will say that something that they do on Strid and on Dodengang and they do on the most recent album as well, in part, is they have a very interesting approach to melody that is very lengthy and sometimes can almost remind me of groups like Summoning. It has almost like a classical or medieval feel to the melodies that really can be breathtaking with its contrast to the grinding, chaotic riffing. And so with the most recent album, for instance, to close on Samoth, I would like to heap praise upon them by saying that there are some of those really almost awe-inspiring moments, like on the track's Last Gasp of the Dying. The introduction of that melodic riff hit me very deeply. And on the next track, Crushed, Shattered, and Destroyed, it's not so much the thematic introduction of the melody, but the melody on that track also has a very interesting, like I said, almost classical or medieval approach. So yeah, very awesome band and very excellent quality on their part.
Yeah, I thought that song, definitely had some strong melodies, but the riff construction just seemed a little weird to me. But yes, was that your third band, Tyler? Yes, it was.
Yes, it was. Yep, that's it for me.
Rockheads and Samoth. I know Daniel Lake is short on time, so let's go with you next, and then we'll get to Raphael for his favorite bands. So, Daniel, what are some underrated bands, sir?
Yeah, so when you talked about underrated bands, I did bring up like what does that mean a little bit, just because I had to think about like I was looking through tons of bands that I like and thinking lots of these bands are perfectly rated. They are correctly rated. Uh, there are lots of bands that I think are great, but for various reasons, if they have small audiences, it makes some sense to me. Um, Shelly, you were kind of talking about how when you were talking about the Chasm having a ton of records, this was actually part of my thought process was like for a band to be underrated, meaning they should be thought better of. I thought maybe they should have a pretty solid body of work to draw from. So anyway, that was kind of part of my thought process. I chose bands that have a pretty solid body of work. The first one that I chose was the California band Vastum. It's a great death metal band, kind of a powerhouse band. They've got members that are also playing in Acephalix, Hammers of Misfortune, Necrot, Mortuous, Ulthar, just lots of like great projects. Vastum is a lot about the themes in these songs are a lot more about personal trauma than kind of any of the war themes or anything on some other death metal. It's not satanic death metal. It's not about the ills of society per se. Vastum writes songs that are about kind of really super fucked up psychological sexual stuff. It's really disturbing music, but it's really cohesive. I think the members of the bands or members of that band are pretty awesome. Layla Abdul Rauf is an amazing artist. She's a guitarist in the band and a vocalist. She adds great stuff to that project, but she also has her own thing. The vocalist Dan Butler is crazy. Like in a live setting, he like leans off the stage and like grabs people by the head and just kind of like lays on the crowd often. It's not a thing he does once in a while. He basically uses the crowd to keep him up off the floor the entire time. It's not stage diving. It's just kind of this crumpled, like not willing to hold his own body weight up while he, screams at people. It's just a very cool package, and I really really appreciate what they do. So, is there anybody else in the group who's spent time with this band?
I recently, since you had mentioned them, I listened to a concert of theirs. I think it was in Oakland. It was on the YouTube. And I actually brought it up on my projector and had them. I was able to see everything in great detail. But as you were talking about their lyrics, I was looking up their lyrics just now, and holy shit, that's some personal stuff. I'm unsure if that's like personal traumas that they've encountered. If so, then I feel sorry for them. But yeah, that's kind of a different take on extreme metal lyrical content, where it's like Chuck Schuldiner with the philosopher, so much about nothing, not even your own sexuality or something like that. And I was just kind of delving into the lyrics here, and it's really graphic stuff. So yeah, but textually speaking, I thought they're part of that Dark Descent OSDM kind of vibe that's in flavor right now. And I would say the closest band to them that I've heard personally is Cruciamentum, which I actually think Cruciamentum, out of all the incantation clones, they're like the least incantation of the incantation clones. Like they tend to have some of their own style in there mixed with that incantation sound. And so in that regard, I thought it was pretty cool. It's like, oh yeah, there's some Cruciamentum vibes here and there, but holy shit, these lyrics, what the hell? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what
Yeah, it's pretty great.
Any other thoughts on Vastum? I mean, just look up their lyrics and you want to take a shower afterwards.
Well, yeah, I had not come across them until you selected them, Daniel. But yeah, I definitely got the incantation thing, and I think again a similar kind of modern contemporary comparison would be someone like Father Befouled. But again, I think Father Befouled make a point of trying to sound exactly like incantation, which isn't necessarily a good thing. Whereas Vastum definitely have their own thing going on. Yeah, so I was listening to their latest album, which I didn't realize was called Orificial Purge, which is quite evocative as well. But yeah, it's definitely cornered a unique little spot in terms of like the bands that sort of take a lot of influence from incantation. And I didn't realize as well the vocalist, he sings in another band called can't pronounce it properly because I've never heard anyone say it out loud, Dragcar, who are kind of like a sort of simpler Rotting Christ heavy metal come death metal black metal outfit, but they released an album a few years ago and he did the vocals on that at the Crossroads of Infinity. So yeah, I didn't actually realize there was a connection there, so yeah, that's pretty cool as well. But yeah, quality band. Yeah, thanks for bringing them up.
Yeah, I just was looking at some of their lyrics myself and was pretty taken aback by the line on one of their earlier albums, "Internalized horror of what lies beneath the belt." Definitely seems like some very hardcore trauma that they're covering thematically. Definitely could tell that they had influences from groups like Incantation and maybe other groups that were influenced by Incantation. And I can see where Jason is drawing comparisons to Cruciamentum. As far as their music goes, I believe that I listened to the same concert that Jason is talking about when I went to go check them out, because in the spirit of this episode being about underrated groups, I had never heard of them until they were mentioned in the context of covering them on this episode. So yeah, if that's a pretty common experience with this group, then they are definitely not receiving as much attention as they may merit.
Daniel?
Yeah, full agreement on that. Full agreement. I think they get mentioned here and there. I think maybe the name is a little bit of a barrier. It sounds like, a fair amount of other, short, punchy, Latin-esque names that some death metal bands have, but I think they stand out musically. Yeah.
All right, so you had chosen two other bands, and I do want to apologize.
Sure, yeah.
My ignorance. I did not listen to them. I had some stuff come up this weekend, and yesterday I was in a world of hungover pain and moving around boxes, and it was really hot here. So I apologize. I did not do my homework for this episode, but what are two other underrated bands?
So I'm actually glad that you didn't do some of this homework, because I'll be honest, the other two bands I think you'd probably hate. You mentioned
Yeah.
earlier.
Actually, I did listen to each band for 1 second, and I turned them
Okay.
off.
Yeah, that sounds right. You talked earlier about man, I don't remember which band you were saying, something that definitely kept your attention, that you were praising, bands that definitely keep your attention. Maybe it was Rotheads. This next band I'm going to bring up would definitely not do that. This band, Old Man Gloom. They're one of those bands that I think they require people to decide to give them attention. They don't go grabbing at it. And again, this band is made up of people from various other, like, much better known projects. Members of Old Man Gloom are also in Converge, ISIS, Cave In. They make almost kind of infuriating music. There's lots of noise. Then there's these bursts of like grindy, sludgy, heavy stuff. But then it's all kind of it's extended out with all these protracted passages that are either quieter or just it's not clear where they're going. For a while, they leaned on this idea that the full name of the band was the Old Man Gloom Alien Simian Defense League, and leaned on this kind of ape monkey from space thing.
Are they like Mr. Bungle?
They're not. I mean, it's very much in the sludge kind of grind. Grind and sludge kind of do not go hand in hand. But if you were to go really fast and then not, it's not like Bungle in that it's widely varied types of music. It's just that there's a lot of like other kinds of noises, non-music, found sound stuff. I just think that this band makes, over time, they've made some extremely cool artifacts, musical artifacts, sound artifacts that deserve people's time if they choose to give it. I'm a strong, committed lover of their Christmas album, which is a horrible thing to say out loud, and it makes me feel weird for saying it. They have an album called Christmas. I love it top to bottom. They've got a half-hour track they called Zozobra that's also pretty great.
Have you ever listened to Penderecki? He came out with a Christmas symphony, and that is some dark and disturbing music. Penderecki, the classical composer.
I'm going to have to listen to that because that sounds great.
Yeah, it just reminded me of that. I was like, wow, this is actually really fucking cool for a Christmas symphony. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry for jumping in.
No, just that I think that given that these members, their other projects are so well known, this band is probably, in some cases, just kind of shrugged off as a joke band, even though I feel like their music is very much not a joke. But I just think they deserve a kind of attention that I think a lot of people are probably not willing to give them. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's another one where I completely unfamiliar with them, and I was just sort of browsing through their Metal Archives page, and I noticed that given that they've got quite a few albums, they've only got a handful of reviews. They're all positive reviews, but I don't know if they're one of those bands that, because they span genres and like approaches and philosophies, it's one of these where not, people that are firmly in the metal camp don't necessarily get them, and then maybe they're a bit too metal for people that would be into the noise or experimental aspects. I don't know if that might be what they suffer from, because a lot of bands that go on the more experimental side, sometimes they do struggle to sort of find their audience, but I think that's kind of a holdover from sort of tribalist thinking in a way. So yeah, they're definitely another one that I should probably look into.
Also, they tend to put out too much music all at once. The last two albums they've put out have been pretty much double albums, and they're not short record. Like each one is itself quite long, and it's just a ton of time required to put in. Things are not catchy. They do not do catchy things. So you kind of, anyway, I'm not selling the band very well, but it's kind of exactly in the wheelhouse what I like to spend my effort on when I get a chance to do so.
Yeah, I checked out their album, Seminar 9, Darkness of Being. And it's not really like my kind of style, because I find things that are like influenced by like post-hardcore or like hardcore adjacent difficult to listen to sometimes, because it has such a different approach than metal, whereas a lot of the metal, at least that I enjoy, tends to go for like a certain kind of logic that connects riffs within the piece, and even if it's an abstract one, a lot of the hardcore adjacent material like sludge tries to go purposely, I get the intent behind it, for something that's more meant to disjoint consciousness, that's almost more meant to constantly jolt your awareness and create a sense of disorder or confusion. And so that kind of aspect of it is not something that is particularly to my taste. But you can definitely hear that they have members from groups like Converge, although they certainly go for somewhat more of a doom laden approach than that band does. And it's definitely something that I think would appeal pretty well to a certain segment of the metal audience today. So I'm not sure why that segment hasn't caught on to the group more.
Yeah, I hear you. So, and unless there's other commentary on that, I'm happy to go on to the third band.
Yeah. Let's do the third band. Honestly, I don't know how to pronounce their name, so you take the lead.
Yeah, man, I had to look it up, and I've been pronouncing it wrong for years. Apparently, it's pronounced Dicatafalque. And yeah, this guy is from Hungary. He moved to Scotland at some point and lived there for a while, although my understanding is he might not be living there anymore. He might have moved back. And this is, a completely different tack from something like Vastum. This music is a lot lighter. Um, the the music that this guy makes, it it really definitely falls into that. It's a casualty of that, like, which box does this land in, kind of a thing, because it's got a black metal. I don't even want to say like necessarily a black metal core to it, because it's not black metal, but it's got a bunch of it draws a lot out of kind of the well of black metal, um for the some of the riffing, the melodies, the character of the music. But then that gets balanced with kind of a lot of Eastern European folk ideas, some dance music stuff, electronic stuff. This dude is super prolific. He's put out, a ton of records in the past 10 years, 10, 15 years. It's a varying quality. I think there are two records of his that I am deeply engaged in. One called Rangateg from about 12 years ago. And then Vadak was a record he put out just a couple years ago. Both of those, I think, are really, really good, very engaging. But he's got a ton of other stuff. I think last week or maybe it was this past Friday, he put out a record that's a lot more metal focused than some of his other stuff has been recently. It's definitely kind of weird, but there's a lot going on. It's a very cool approach, and I think maybe it doesn't get a whole lot of attention just because there are too many things that are trying to happen, and I think people who like one side of his sound might be totally turned off by the other sides.
Do you think it might be his fashion of why he's underrated? Because this guy does not wear cheap clothes at all. I'm looking at pictures of him right now, and he wears a suit top, and he definitely has a strong sense of fashion. Whereas the average metalhead, they just like wearing band t-shirts and black pants. Where this guy, you can tell his attire that he's wearing is at least $200. Do you think the fashion aspect may be holding him back a little bit?
Well, I mean, you're not wrong. I haven't seen a lot of pictures of him, so that hadn't kind of entered into my mind. But it makes a lot of sense given the sound that he's putting out. His fashion sense certainly matches the sound. Yeah, that could definitely turn some people off.
Yeah, it's like you want to meet up with him for an interview, and it's at a fancy restaurant somewhere, and this is a 3 to 5 course meal with everyone dressed really well and all that. So yeah, honestly, like I said, I hadn't listened to this project, and it was kind of cool to get your take on it. Did anyone check out this band?
I actually used to be a fan of them in my teenage years when I went through a kind of progressive avant-garde metal phase. And I listened to them quite a bit during the time, and I raved about them quite a bit. I don't remember their music very well from when I used to listen to them, because that would have been around between like 2005 and 2008. and if I remember right, they had only released like maybe like 3 albums by that point. But I did go back and revisit their music. Ironically, their music, a track from their most recent album was on an official Spotify playlist for new metal. That track from the new Samoth album was also on. And I think that the man is clearly very talented and has a really good mastery of instruments and composition. I have similar complaints to it that I have about the Chasm, which is that sometimes the music seems to get so lost in certain forms of experimentation that the riffs that are underlying it are really kind of just common heavy metal riffs, at least to my listening. But I don't want that to detract from the fact that he is a very talented instrumentalist. He has a very good approach to being able to incorporate a lot of diverse influences and a lot of diverse instrumentation.
Yeah, again, going back to because again, obviously my first point of call would be Metal Archives to check a new band out and stuff. And I can tell they kind of gave up with the description, so they just called it avant-garde metal, which is fair enough. If there's that much going on, there's no point like writing out a great long list of all the subgenres that this guy dabbles in. But yeah, it's another one where I was not familiar with them. I will be honest to say it's not my jam, but it sounds like I'm not the only one in that regard, in that there is a lot going on. And when you do pull on so many different genres and so many different traditions, some people really vibe with that and sort of really get on with like the will to experiment. For me, sometimes I do tend to get a bit overwhelmed by it, and I kind of struggle to picture the vision that's coming out. But admittedly, I was only listening to a handful of his records last night, so he's got quite a big body of work. So it's definitely one for me to sort of go back on and see what's there. But yeah, definitely another kind of left field choice that is quite an interesting one by the looks of it.
Would you say it's like perennial philosophy, where a perennial philosophy looks at universal truths throughout the world's religions and philosophies? And when something is about everything in that regard, it's not really about anything, because it takes so much from a lot of different subjects and aspects of life, that once you jumble up all those different things, it may not be about anything specific. Is it like that?
Well, I wouldn't level that at this guy, because like I said, I'm not as familiar with his discography to sort of make that claim. But I would say the tradition of like experimental progressive metal in general, or stuff that self-identifies as that, it is always in danger of becoming I always use the metaphor of it's like skipping through a Spotify playlist on shuffle really fast, when it just jumps from style to style to style with no kind of overarching philosophy that's guiding it through. That's not to say that you shouldn't mix genres and you shouldn't like try and broaden the kind of influence that you're pulling from. I think it can work really, really well. It's just, it has to be done with a certain degree of forethought and some sort of clear vision that you're trying to articulate through the breadth of the music that you're calling on.
Yeah, and I definitely think that, in some cases he is, skipping between styles. But I do think his strongest material, there's not a sense of that so much as the various styles that he's pulling into his songs complement each other, or they are thematically related, and so they tie together within the songs really, really well. Again, for somebody just getting into this stuff, that 2011 album Rengeteg, or however that is actually pronounced, is extremely good at tying these concepts together and making the stylistic differences really work in context.
Cool. Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. The 2011 album. Cool. I know you have to jet, Daniel, so it's been a great pleasure having you on today. And happy Father's Day. I think you're the only father on the program today, and I know Shelly's a soon-to-be father, so and maybe next year we can do this again when we can both say Happy Father's Day. I mean, we can celebrate it. But yeah, thank you, Daniel. Have a good rest of your day, sir.
That's right. Thanks a lot. I appreciate how you have me on.
Yes, sir. Always great to have you. All right.
Cheers, Daniel. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Great to talk to you.
Yep. Raphael, I believe you are next.
Yeah. All right. So I'll also go from also start with the most famous band, and I guess it's going to be probably a controversial and a weird choice that might not make much sense at first, but it has to do with the very specific interpretation of underrated that I applied here, and that band is Tiamat. More specifically, the god phase of Tiamat. That is the one that starts with Wild Honey. Now, I actually, to be entirely honest, I think Tiamat is one of those bands that it has always suffered a sort of identity crisis from the very beginning. And I actually don't think that their very first album, that is the straightforward death metal album, is that successful. The later ones like Estel Sleep and Clouds, which are sort of transitional albums, I think uh, they got gradually better. But in any case, the struggle was there. This constant search for a sort of another type of expression that fit them better. And I think that only truly happened on Wild Honey. Now, I think they are underrated in the sense that this phase in particular is, even though it's probably it's the phase that got them the most mainstream attention and popularity in our circles, that is in people that are more focused on underground metal, extreme metal, etc. There's a tendency to sort of despise, this phase and to see it as selling out. But I actually see it exactly on the opposite way. I think that's when they actually found their voice. It just happened that their voice was more, more accessible and poppy material. But I think what matters is that they really handled this more poppy god sound. Probably, I would say, the best way that any extreme metal band has done it. I think it's a very, even though it's obviously a very well. There's a lot of there's some some more formulaic stuff maybe, and it's very catchy, very no, very accessible overall. But I think there's also a lot of inventivity there. The way they just mixed all these different elements together in a way that's not gratuitous, in my opinion. I think it really ends up combining nicely and fitting nicely. So I'm mostly referring again to the album to Wild Honey, which is their best in my opinion. Although you can also include a deeper kind of slumber there. In fact, that's when they actually branch out even more. They start incorporating psychedelia, even some industrial elements, a lot of electronics, even some kind of folky tribal elements. It's just a very experimental approach to that type of sound, while at the same time being sort of like I was saying, very catchy and accessible. So yeah, not sure if anyone has anything to say. I think Shelley, just by virtue of being British, kind of has an obligation to comment on these subjects.
Okay, can I chime in first? So my first Tiamat album, if I pronounce that correctly, was when I was 12. I got the musical history of Tiamat. And honestly, back then I was just so into death metal that I only played it a couple of times and I never listened to it again, nor have I listened to this band again since I was 12. But yeah, definitely I need to check out, some of their later stuff. That here you are, all these years later, chatting about them. But I did have the musical history of Tiamat back when I was 12. So it's a band that I've always overlooked because I wanted more and more extreme stuff back then, and I never got back around to them. So I'll definitely check out their more gothy stuff, I should say. But go ahead, Shelley.
Well, yeah, like you, I don't actually have as much to say on them as you'd think. I think I went through a phase about a decade ago, maybe a bit more, because I was on a big typo negative kick at the time, and a friend of me recommended these guys as like a more serious kind of example of goth metal or whatever, or kind of that formula, but done without the sort of sarcastic, ironic humor and sort of lack of focus that Typo Negative tended to have at times. And yeah, I remember sort of being a bit nonplussed. Being brutally honest, it's because I was listening to Typo Negative for a very specific reason, and I wasn't really in it for the music. I was in it to using music as therapy for a particular tough time with girl troubles at the time. And Tiamat is not a band that is for. They sort of do a very different brand of goth metal where it's much more serious and a musical and intellectual experience rather than a purely emotive one. But yeah, I think now that you brought them up again, I definitely need to go and revisit, particularly that sort of mid-90s period that you're referencing there, because yeah, it sounds like I've sort of missed a trick with that one.
Yeah, I kind of really liked Raphael's point about them finding their own voice, because I will outright admit that I don't enjoy their goth material or even their death metal material at all. But I do think that they are a better band as a goth band. Their death metal material kind of largely just sounded like young metalheads worshiping their influences, and didn't have as much of like a unique statement to make as some of their peers. But it's a similar opinion that I have to the band Catatonia, which I also don't like at all, which is that I always felt like Catatonia was made worse by the pretense to be a metal band at all, and that if they just would go full sell on making sort of gothic rock, that it would be more true to where their talents lie. And I think that was a really excellent observation on Raphael's part about Tiamat.
Yeah, well, because the natural assumption indeed is that the more commercially viable the sound that the band is trying, it's the less honest it's being. But sometimes I think Tiamat is one of those cases. Well, I guess there aren't many cases like that, but I do think it's one of those cases where it's the other way around. And I think your description of their death metal stuff is really on point. That's exactly how I felt it as well. It kind of has a sort of, well, I don't dislike it strongly, just doesn't really communicate very deeply with me. And I think it does have a very amateurish sound to it. And well, I think your image was very good. Just a few young guys trying to do some death metal, at all costs, just trying to worship their influences. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. Right. So if no one has any more comments, I guess I'll go for the second band. So my second pick is a Japanese band. It's Intestine Baalism. Now I think their first full-length album was in 1997, and I think that's a very significant thing, because in some ways, and I think this is one of the things about the band that I like the most, is that they sort of work as a synthesis of what death metal, of pretty much all of the different strains of death metal at the time. So there's a more melodic Swedish type sound, except in their case they give it a unique twist, sort of Japanese twist, so to speak, in that some of their solos and even lead guitar in general, or even the riffs at some points, are melodic in an admittedly perhaps sometimes an over-the-top way that almost resembles the typical Japanese video game music or anime music. And I think that's probably one of the main reasons that puts off a lot of people, especially a lot of people from our circles. But besides those elements, they also have the more suffocation style, percussive, brutal death metal, and some parts that likely will remind you of Dismember, for example. But overall, I think that their main strength is how they. I don't think this is a very just a gratuitous mismatch. I think their songwriting is very elegant, in my opinion. Just to give one example of many examples that I could give, the song "A Place Their Gods Left Behind" from their very first album, Anatomy of the Beast. I think it flows extremely well, to the point. It's one of those rare songs in extreme metal where the change in riffs is almost imperceptible. The riffs really flow like hot lead, sometimes, and even the transitions to the solos and to the more melodic parts. Also, extraordinary vocal performance, in my opinion. I think it's one of the best death metal performances in terms of high pitched vocals. And yeah, overall, I think it's for anyone that likes death metal. I think it's they really have the whole package. I think they besides just the songwriting, which I think is their main strength. I think all of these different elements are really they really put them into a very nice harmony, I think.
Let's see. So Daniel Lake would have been a good one to chime in on this. I know he had to leave, I guess for Father's Day stuff or who knows. But about a year ago, Daniel Lake, we were just, I forget what it was, but he saw a list of bands, and we just as like an exercise just wrote reviews of some specific albums. And one of those reviews that I wrote that he had shown me from a list was Intestine Baalism. And the album in question was An Anatomy of the Beast. And I came to a very similar conclusion with my review, that this was just for fun that we were doing just to keep the writing juices flowing. That there was like Swedish death metal without the Boss HM2 pedal. So when you brought up like Dismember, I can totally see that with An Anatomy of the Beast. But this is one of those bands that I haven't spent that much time with, but out of the list of bands that we wrote reviews on, just as an exercise, this was the band that stood out the most to me. And there was like maybe 6 other bands. So yeah, I did enjoy it the most out of the bundle for that just writing exercise.
I personally really enjoy this band, especially that particular album, Anatomy of the Beast. It is really powerful. It's a very elegant and stylistic, powerful album. They have a really good sense of being able to keep a flow of momentum that has a lot of impact. Whatever style that they're incorporating at any given moment in any of the songs. It definitely has a bit of a unique Japanese approach, even though their influences are clearly a lot of various types of Swedish metal, from some of the more like classic heavy metal, like Euro metal styles, to Swedish death metal, in that it can be very theatrical. Their incorporation of some of the very heavy metal style guitar solos and melodies aren't just kind of stapled in. They're used to like create very theatrical moments in the song. And one of the things that I've always particularly liked about that album is later in the album, they have these really wonderful, odd floating melodies, almost similar to Cemetery on the album An Evil Shade of Grey, that are very eerie and create a sort of powerful but like playful sense of darkness. They are certainly an underrated band, in that particular album should be considered a really strong contender for an almost classic album of their era.
Yeah, I agree perfectly. I think you brought some good points in regarding those more floating parts, and that reminds me of a whole other aspect, which is that in contrast to the Boss H2M production, they actually have a very very sharp production on that album, and very spacious as well. The way they handle you can see that there's a lot of care gone into the production in general, and the way they handle the vocals, for example, sometimes different layers of vocals, and even the guitars. It's a very detailed soundscape that they create, and yes, again, those I think you make a very good portrait of what the music sounds like. Yeah, that's very playful, but and theatrical. Sometimes, admittedly, a bit cheesy, I guess. But overall, I think it fits, and it's forgivable considering the strength of the overall material. Yeah. So not sure if Shelley has anything to say about this particular band.
No, I have heard of them, but I'll be honest and say I have not actually given them a proper listen, so I don't really have anything to contribute. But I'll definitely check out an Anatomy of the Beast after this, based on what you guys have said.
Yeah, all right. So the final band that I chose to highlight here is I think this is the most obscure from the ones that I've picked. Is a Skin Chamber, which is an industrial metal band. Skin Chamber was actually a side project of Controlled Bleeding, and I think this is a very important aspect because Controlled Bleeding, for anyone who knows them, is a very very experimental, very it's a band that they have almost dozens of albums, and they have touched on a whole lot of a huge amount of different genres, going from the purer harsh noise stuff to dub and some experiments with almost prog rock, etc. So a very experimental approach overall, and I think a lot of that seeps into Skin Chamber, and that's one of their strengths, in my opinion, because industrial metal, I think, is a very it's a genre that's very easy to fall into, very into formulas, just some programmed drums, some indistinct guitar distortion on top, some shouting vocals, and then some effects, of course. And a lot of the tracks on Skin Chamber, I guess they sort of sound like that in a way. But overall, I think there's for anyone who checks out their first album, for example, Wound, there's an undeniable amount of creativity there, and I think the overall experimental approach of Controlled Bleeding is present in Skin Chamber, and that's what gives the band their edge, I think. So there's a lot of interesting, unconventional, unexpected touches regarding the layering, the textures. Some tracks that are almost more based on ambience. Some tracks are almost music concrete, very based on completely just the play of different sounds. Some are more structured, some are slow and agonizing. A lot of a lot of playful experiments with the scenes and the instruments, etc. The texture overall. So yeah, I think as far as industrial metal goes, I know this might be a very controversial position, but on the strength of those aspects, I would actually put them pretty much on the same place as, let's say, the best Godflesh. So yeah, that's pretty much my. I was just talking about the Wound, but they only have two albums. Besides Wound, they also have Trial. Wound is my favorite, but yeah, both of the albums are pretty much recommended for anyone looking for that type of soundscape.
Yeah, I would say like a really surface level reading of them is as like an American answer to Godflesh, and they do have a lot of obvious similarities. But again, speaking of Wounds specifically, they borrow a lot more obviously from Swans. I know early Godflesh, and particularly when they were Fall of the Cause, on that Life is Easy kind of collection, there's pure Swans worship on there as well. But Skin Chamber definitely kind of expand upon that, and the sort of their approach is different to Godflesh, in that Godflesh, again, one could accuse them, even on Street Cleaner, of having a groove, but it's such an odd kind of syncopated and very idiosyncratic approach to groove, whereas Skin Chamber borrow much more heavily from drone and noise and early Swans as well, to kind of create an ambience, and it almost kind of bleeds to outside of metal at that point, even though some of the riffs are metallic in a sort of obvious way. The construction of songs isn't motivated by the same thing that a metal band would be, whereas I think Godflesh always did have quite a firm foot in the metal camp, whereas Skin Chamber are much more experimental. And there are even, on Wound, it's a lengthy album, there are even sort of some tracks that bleed into an almost like rocky kind of danceable rhythm, but for the most part it's a very kind of crushing and despairing album. And I think the interesting thing is, if you sort of plot it along with Godflesh and early Scorn and Sonic Violence, and bands like that, and comparing them to their sort of lineage throughout the 80s and into the 70s, like electronic music in the 60s and 70s, it kind of fed into this idea of like an optimism, a futurism that was kind of anticipating tomorrow and waiting for the utopia that would come and all of the wonderful things that science and technology would bring us. And then by the late 80s and early 90s, you have a very different, almost nihilistic, anomic kind of attitude towards technology that's expressed through these artists via the likes of like Throbbing Gristle and Swans and Skinny Puppy and like various industrial artists of the 80s. And they're not looking at technology with like relish and excitement. They're looking at it as this all-pervasive, like, what's the word? This concept, not the individual artifacts of technology, but just this swirling concept that surrounds them, that's forever, you know, creating means of surveillance, creating means of enemy, creating means of oppression. And they express this through their music and through sort of the lens of technology being a source of conflict and alienation. And I think Skin Chamber actually get that sense across more effectively than Godflesh, even though I would still say Godflesh have more expressive range with what they do. But I don't want to sort of quibble over who was the superior, but I would definitely agree with your choice to put them here because they are underrated. The more people should know about them in sort of the early industrial canon rather than the likes of Ministry and Nine Inch Nails. I think more true-blooded industrial fans who also sit in the metal camp should check out Skin Chamber for sure.
Yeah, so what you mentioned about technology being like all-encompassing and oppressive and alienating, that made me think that it's quite Heideggerian in a sense that like Heidegger looked at the being of technology and he came up with a similar conclusion that it was quite alienating. Raphael, being that you delved into Heidegger, do you see that Skin Chamber may be like a Heideggerian type of industrial project? Because I've heard, you know, quite a bit of industrial, but it's definitely not one of my favorite genres. But you know, that lineage from like Boyd Rice to, you know, Throbbing Gristle, which was mentioned, some of those textures were just used in a very harsh and oppressive way. And Skin Chamber kind of does that as well. Do you think that's like a Heideggerian type of statement at all, Raphael? Or am I misinterpreting Heidegger?
Well, I think it's interesting because I specifically mentioned Heidegger in my review of Skin Chamber. So yes, I definitely think so. And I think it's a great point that Shelley has brought up because in a sense, I think that this whole aspect, I think it has always been present, even if in a subterranean, unconscious way in electronic music. Because if you think about it, the premise of electronic music is indeed it lends itself very easily to this more dystopian or to this vision of technology as described by Heidegger, the Gestell, right? And all of these specific imagery that has been building up throughout, now it's been decades of cyberpunk, sci-fi cinema and literature about all these things. Because if you think about it, the very premise of electronic music, this idea of music that's done completely with computers and music that has the potential to be completely inhuman in the sense that it's almost done without any human intervention. It's very cold and mechanistic. It really is the sound of all those aspects of modernity and postmodernity. And if you think about bands, like, even though, like Shelley said, there's also a side of electronic music that's always been very optimistic, and because it's always been tied together, at least in the beginning, with dance music. I think a lot of electronic bands, including very early ones, they took advantage of this more darker aspect. If you think about, for example, Clock DVA, I think it's a very good example. And yes, Skin Chamber, even though it's not strictly an electronic band, it's I do think they do something very interesting with these ideas as well. And well, they are indeed, as Shelley pointed out, they are borderline metal. I think they are metal enough to be mentioned here, but they do have a very eclectic approach that really touches on a lot of different things, a lot of more electronic, more just a very experimental approach in general. But I think that's indeed one of their strengths.
Yeah, I think if you take like the comparison to say some of this obviously can be traced back to the likes of Kraftwerk, and Kraftwerk were very much embracers of technology to the point where they wanted to basically be an artificial band. They wanted to completely integrate themselves into the machine and took like their music is a celebration of all things technological. Whereas bands like Skin Chamber, through the lens of some of the industrial bands of the 80s, retain the human element and want to focus on the human within the machine and what the kind of psychological traumas are that are created from that, rather than this open embrace of technology. And I just think the contrasting expressions are very interesting, and the fact that they came from very different eras and to some extent different backgrounds as well. Because I think Skin Chamber ultimately have their roots in punk if you trace it back far enough, and it's a very different attitude to Kraftwerk, who are sort of tech natives, if you will. But yeah, it's an interesting one.
Tyler, any thoughts on Skin Chamber?
Yeah, I used to listen to them quite a bit back when I was listening to Swans a lot, and actually Brutal Truth's album Need to Control. I had forgotten about them entirely until the preparation for this episode when Raphael reminded me of them. I think that pretty much their sort of thematic content has been entirely covered. I think that including them in an episode about underrated metal bands is totally merited, because I would say that with all of the influences that they have from industrial acts, and I don't even know if you would particularly consider Swans entirely an industrial act, but groups like Swans with a sort of harsh noise aspect, that one of the strengths of their music that puts them a step above those kind of groups, in my opinion, is the powerful like thematic statements they make in their riffs when they choose to bring in a sort of a metal or hardcore riff. It's also really interesting, the danceable rhythms that Shelley brought up, because the way they're brought in almost is as if it's meant to be something more of an ambient effect than a focal point of the music, almost as if they're trying to recreate the fragmented and distracted mind of someone who's largely leading a mechanistic existence within modern society, like somebody who's shacking up in a tiny apartment in a large city and is barely hanging on as they cycle back in the routine from work back to their home, and the kind of noise that they would hear filtering through their mind, you know, from the television or from advertisements or from the noise happening outside. It's a really interesting approach.
I see. So yeah, this might be the longest Necropolis episode ever. We've gone over 2 hours, I believe. And that was 3 bands, correct, Raphael? Sorry, I haven't. We did Intestine, Baalism, Skin Chamber.
Yeah, exactly. Mhm.
Okay. And yeah, so I think we're going to wrap up. Any last thoughts today about any of the underrated bands? Definitely check out the bands that we mentioned today, and you can always form your own opinion. We're not forcing you to like any of them. These are all bands that we personally view that has been quite overlooked in the mainstream consciousness. Especially the bands that I chose, I believe they're the best ones, but I'm not going to split hairs in that regard.
Of course you fucking will.
Right.
But yeah, definitely check out that Serpent Ascending and the electronic Beherit and the Desecracy. Have a great rest of your day and have a great Father's Day.